The cottage sat alone where the dirt road bent into the trees, as if the forest had decided to leave one small space untouched. It was made of fieldstone stacked by hand, roofed in dark slate, with a narrow chimney rising from the center. Ivy climbed one wall. Moss covered parts of the foundation. A single wooden door faced the road, worn silver by rain and time. Nothing about it looked valuable. That was exactly why no one wanted it. Clara Wynne stood in the road with a canvas bag over her shoulder and stared at the place she had bought for $5. At 18 years old, with nowhere left to sleep and almost no money left to her name, she had become the owner of a forgotten midwife's cottage. She still wasn't sure whether that meant she was lucky or reckless. 3 days earlier, she had been sleeping in the back room of a diner after closing. 2 days earlier, the owner told her kindly but firmly that she couldn't stay anymore. 1 day earlier, she wandered into the county auction because it was warm and she needed a chair. That was when she heard the listing. Tax-forfeited rural structure. Former midwife's residence. Minimum bid, $5. People smirked. Road floods every spring. Too far from town. Probably full of raccoons. No one raised a hand. Clara did. The gavel came down before she could second-guess herself. Now the key felt cold in her hand. She crossed the short path through dead leaves and fitted it into the lock. The mechanism stuck once, then turned. The door opened inward with a heavy scrape. The air inside smelled of old wood, herds, dust, and stone. Not mold. That was the first good sign. Light entered through 2 small windows, enough to reveal a single large room with a hearth at one end, shelves along the walls, and a narrow staircase leading to a loft. A table stood near the center. 3 mismatched chairs. A cast-iron kettle hung over the cold fireplace. Clara stepped in carefully, listening to the floorboards. They creaked, but held. The walls were thick enough to mute the wind outside. The room felt poor, but sturdy. Used hard. Built well. This could be worse, she said softly, then smiled to herself. She had said that a lot lately. The loft above held a small bed frame, a chest missing its lid, and one narrow shelf. The mattress was useless, but the space was dry. That alone made it better than several places she had slept recently. She spent the afternoon cleaning, opening shutters, sweeping leaves and dust, dragging broken items outside, sorting what could still be used. The shelves contained dozens of small jars, most empty, some still holding dried lavender, sage, or roots too old to identify. The former owner had worked here seriously once. By evening, the room looked less abandoned and more paused. Clara built a small fire using fallen branches from outside and heated canned soup on the kettle hook. The warmth changed everything. The stone walls glowed amber. The cottage felt less like a relic and more like shelter. She ate at the old table and looked around slowly. For the first time in months, she was indoors, alone, and not afraid someone would tell her to leave in the morning. That feeling nearly made her cry. She swallowed it down. After dinner, she continued exploring. The shelves near the hearth drew her attention. Unlike the others, these were built directly into the stone wall and deeper than necessary. One shelf held old ledgers, water-damaged at the edges but readable in places. Another held folded linens so brittle they tore when touched. The lowest shelf was empty except for a flat stone slab leaning against the back wall. Clara crouched. The slab looked different from the cottage stones. Smoother, shaped, deliberate. She gripped both sides and tugged. Heavier than expected. It slid forward several inches, scraping the floor. Behind it was darkness. She froze, then slowly lifted her flashlight from the table and aimed it into the gap. A cavity had been built into the wall behind the shelf. Not large, but intentional. Her pulse quickened. People hid things in walls for reasons. Sometimes money, sometimes letters, sometimes things better forgotten. She widened the opening enough to squeeze her arm inside. Her fingers touched wood. A box. She pulled it out carefully. It was cedar, about the size of a bread loaf, with a simple brass latch. No lock. No markings. Clara set it on the table and stared at it for a long moment. Then opened it. Inside were bundles wrapped in cloth. She unfolded the first one. Silver coins. Old but real. Not many. Perhaps enough to matter to someone poor, but not enough to change a life. The second bundle held jewelry. A brooch, 2 rings, a thin chain. Practical pieces, not extravagant. Likely family keepsakes. The third bundle contained papers. That was what made her sit down. Letters. Receipts. Birth records, property notes, names, dates, signatures, carefully preserved. Clara skimmed the first page, then another, then a ledger bound in leather. It belonged to Martha Wynne, midwife. Wynne, her own surname. She frowned. Wynne was not rare, but not common either in that county. She turned pages faster. The ledger listed births attended across nearby farms over 40 years. Payments in eggs, cloth, firewood, sometimes cash. Notes on families. Who moved, who died, who inherited land. Then a folded family page slipped loose. A handwritten record of children and grandchildren. At the bottom was a name Clara recognized instantly. Her grandmother's father. She stared at it, then read upward again, then again slower. Martha Wynne was not just another Wynne. She was family, her great-great-grandmother. Clara sat very still. The cottage had not been random. The name at auction had been listed only as former midwife's residence. No family connection mentioned. No history noted. Yet somehow, by chance or fate or simple paperwork, she had bought back something once belonging to her own bloodline. She looked around the room differently now. The hearth, the shelves, the table worn smooth by hands. Someone from her family had built a life here when life was harder than she could imagine. Then she noticed one final paper at the bottom of the box. A map, hand-drawn. The cottage marked its center. Nearby fields, creek, road, and behind the chimney wall. A symbol, a square beneath the stone foundation. Clara's breathing slowed. She looked toward the hearth, toward the chimney base built from larger stones than the rest. Beneath the stone, she whispered. The auction title had mentioned nothing. But the map did. Something hidden under the foundation near the fireplace. She grabbed the flashlight and crossed the room. At the hearth, one broad flagstone in front of the fireplace looked slightly different from the others. Less worn, tighter fitted. She knelt and brushed soot and dust away from the seam. There was a metal ring set flush into the surface, nearly invisible under grime. Her heart pounded now. The wall box had been one secret. This was another. Maybe the real one. She hooked 2 fingers into the ring and pulled. The stone did not move. She pulled harder. Still nothing. Clara stood, found the iron poker by the hearth, wedged it under the edge, and pressed down with all her weight. The stone shifted with a deep, grinding sound. Cold air rose from below. A hidden shaft opened beneath the hearthstone. Stone steps descended into darkness. Clara aimed the flashlight downward. The beam reached only partway. At the bottom, she could just make out the edge of a wooden door. She swallowed hard. The cottage had belonged to her family. The map had led here, and whatever was below had been sealed for generations. She took one cautious step downward, then another. The air smelled dry, old, preserved. At the bottom, she stood before the wooden door, hand hovering over the latch. Whatever waited beyond it. Her family had meant someone to find it. Clara stood in the narrow stone passage, the flashlight trembling slightly in her hand. The wooden door in front of her was old but solid, reinforced with iron straps darkened by age. No lock, just a latch. She took a breath and lifted it. The metal clicked softly in the silence. Then she pushed. The door opened inward. The room beyond was small, dry, and carefully built beneath the cottage foundation. Stone walls, low ceiling, packed earth floor. Shelves lined one side. A wooden table stood in the center. 2 trunks rested against the far wall. Everything was coated in dust, but nothing was ruined. This was planned, Clara whispered. Not a panic hiding place. Not random storage. A secure room built to preserve things. She stepped inside slowly. The first trunk opened with little resistance. Inside were blankets, jars of preserved seeds, wrapped tools, and neatly folded cloth. Emergency supplies. Useful ones. Historical now. The second trunk was heavier. She lifted the lid carefully. Inside were ledgers, deeds, envelopes tied with ribbon, and a leather pouch. Clara sat on the floor and opened the pouch first. Gold coins. Not many, but enough to have been significant ones. She set them aside and turned to the papers. The top ledger bore the name Martha Wynne. Below it, a note in careful handwriting. For the daughter who keeps going. Clara swallowed hard. She opened the ledger. It wasn't medical notes like the first one upstairs. It was financial records. Loans given quietly to widows. Payments collected slowly from families who could only afford small amounts. Investments in neighboring farmland when owners needed cash. Purchases of creek rights, timber rights, and storage shares in town. Clara blinked. The midwife hadn't just delivered babies. She had built wealth quietly over decades. Another envelope contained property deeds, several parcels around the cottage, a meadow near the creek, a small orchard plot, 2 leased grain fields, and shares in the old Mill Road toll route. Clara stared at the documents. Most had been transferred into a family trust structure meant to pass privately through generations. But the final transfer page was never completed. It stopped with Martha's death. No later signatures. No updated filing. Meaning the assets hadn't been sold. They had been forgotten. She found one final letter folded beneath the deeds. Addressed simply, "To whichever Wynn girl finds this when she most needs it." Clara opened it with shaking hands. "If you are reading this, then life has become difficult again, as it often does. I built what I could because women were rarely given safety. Men called it savings. We called it survival. The land and rights listed here were meant to keep our daughters from begging favors. Use them wisely. Keep the cottage if you can. It shelters more than weather. Martha Wynn." Clara lowered the page slowly. For a long moment, she said nothing. She had spent the last year asking strangers for couches, shifts, chances, patience. And a woman from her bloodline, dead for generations, had spent her life trying to prevent exactly that for someone like her. She laughed once through sudden tears. "Bit late," she whispered, then smiled. But not too late. The next morning, Clara packed the key documents and walked to town. At the county records office, the clerk was skeptical until he saw the original seals, maps, and trust papers. Then he called in a supervisor, then an attorney. The process was not quick. Nothing real ever was. There were title searches, public notices, probate reviews, and verification of surviving heirs. Most lines of the family had moved away or ended. No one contested Clara's claim once lineage and documents were confirmed. 3 months later, the county court recognized her as lawful successor to the dormant family trust. The result was not enormous riches, but it was life-changing. The meadow and orchard land were sold to neighboring farmers at fair value. The grain leases resumed with annual payments. The toll route shares had converted long ago into a small transport easement fund that still paid quarterly income. Combined with the gold coins and a modest savings account the trust had rolled into, Clara suddenly had stability. Real stability. She could have sold everything, including the cottage. Developers asked. One wanted to turn it into a heritage rental retreat. Another offered cash on the spot. Clara refused both. Instead, she repaired the roof, repointed the stone walls, installed plumbing and heat, restored the shutters, kept the hearth exactly as it was. She also enrolled in nursing school in the nearest city, using the trust income to pay tuition and living costs. It felt right. A descendant of a midwife learning how to care for people in her own century. A year later, autumn returned to the forest road. Leaves burned orange and gold around the cottage. Smoke rose cleanly from the chimney. Light glowed warm through the small windows. Clara stood outside with groceries in one hand and textbooks in the other. The road curved into the trees exactly as it had the day she arrived, desperate and unsure. But everything inside her had changed. She stepped through the front door and paused by the hearth. The hidden stone ring was still there, nearly invisible. The room below remained dry and secure, though most documents now sat in a bank archive. She kept Martha's letter in the kitchen drawer. Sometimes she reread it when exams were hard or life felt uncertain. Not because it promised money, because it proved something stronger. Women in her family had been surviving intelligently long before anyone praised them for it. $5 had bought the cottage. But what changed Clara's life wasn't the price. It was discovering that she came from people who planned beyond hardship, and leaving herself no excuse to do less. She set the groceries down, opened a textbook, and stirred soup on the old stove. Outside, the forest darkened. Inside, the cottage held steady, as it always had.